Act Out is independent, non-corporatized activist news. In order to keep us acting out, become a patron at patreon.com/actout. This week on Act Out, the Democrats are launching into a resistance summer. So we're launching into the history of their resistance and looking at present problems in this paradigm. Next up, some good news for Standing Rock. And finally, Anna Tsouhlarakis wants to challenge you and your concept of Native American art. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. We've got a hot summer ahead, and I don't just mean record-breaking temperatures thanks to climate change. Assuming the fuck-ups in the GOP clown car currently careening out of control across our nation can get their act together, we're poised to see devastating legislation targeting some of the most vulnerable people in America. People are angry and ready to act against the system in a way that we haven't seen in years. And creeping in corner number 2 are the Democrats. And despite their feeble attempts at both resistance and distinct alternatives, their newly proposed Resistance Summer is designed to attract new activists and bring a flood of new liberal voters to the polls in upcoming elections. Despite the catchy, chic, goes with a beach tote name, we've seen this sort of thing before from the Democrats. Indeed, while the party claims to support progressive causes, Democrats have a long history of sucking the life out of grassroots movements, zapping momentum for revolutionary change, and directing the energy back into the American status quo at the ballot box. So today, we're going to take a closer look at this resistance based on the tried and true history of the Party in Blue. According to Move On's description of Resistance Summer, the event will come in 3 stages, beginning in June with backyard barbecues called community cookouts. In July, the groups that met at the cookouts are supposed to participate in massive voter registration drives. Finally, in August, they want Democrats to attend the town hall meetings of their Congress members, with demands for the next legislative session. Now, let's start with what the Democrats are getting right. Movement building does begin by getting people together, face to face, to talk and find common ground. After all, that was one of the real superpowers of the Occupy movement and its encampments. And I'm all in favor of people getting more involved in the political process, but basic voter literacy is hardly a summer of resistance. It's more like a summer Civics 101 class. Furthermore, any class or get-together that talks electoral politics without confronting the corruption inherent in the Democratic Party is a half-assed class, and one that cannot hope to effectively dismantle the clusterfuck that is our electoral and political system. Unless the Democrats are willing to challenge issues like gerrymandering, interstate cross-check, which kept millions of votes from being counted in 2016, and corporate money in politics, the giant elephant in the room that's being ignored, despite the huge piles of elephant shit everywhere, no amount of voter registration will make our elections actually democratic. And as for town halls, the indivisible movement based around a political action handbook written by former congressional staffers is already staging successful confrontations with politicians. In fact, many of the most conservative in the GOP have either canceled their town halls altogether or held them over the phone under strictly moderated conditions in order to limit voters' freedom to express their grievances. Now, rather than bolster what Indivisible is already doing, and doing very well, the Democrats want to instead reinvent the wheel, which, of course, really only makes sense if you're afraid that the original wheel is going to roll away from your crooked ass. This play is actually part of a very old Democratic playbook that involves leeching off of progressive causes in a way that frequently ends up hurting both the party and the movement. And it's the reason that we can't allow the Democrats to take charge of the so-called resistance ever again. For one of the clearest examples of this tactic in action, let's travel back in time to early 2011, months before Occupy Wall Street began. For almost half a year, as many as 100,000 protesters staged sit-ins, demonstrations, and collectively held space at the Wisconsin Capitol. While it began as a protest against Governor Scott Walker's ultimately successful efforts to undermine the power of labor unions, like most modern mass movements, it soon gathered diverse supporters with an equally diverse set of grievances against a state government dominated by the Koch brothers and other corporate interests. This diverse, collaborative, flat-structure space captured the attention and the rising anger of people worldwide, from Tahrir Square to the upcoming occupiers in New York City. There was momentum, and there was resolve. And then the Democrats mounted their take over and pull back strategy, doing their best to silence the radical voices and convince others that the electoral path was the answer. As chronicled by journalist Lee Suster, for their part, the Democrats spared no effort to disorganize and demoralize those committed to the occupation. On February 27th, Democratic staffers and their supporters took control of the open mic to call for leaving the building, and Wisconsin Rep. Brett Hulsey called for activists to follow him out the door. Hulsey's efforts fizzled when socialist, student activist, and firefighters union leaders convinced a large contingent to stay for the night. Alas, the victory over spineless Dems was short-lived. Unions, fearing the loss of their labor management partnership, a partnership that since the 50s had become more of a thinly veiled banner for union busting, pulled out of the occupation and fell in line with Democrats and their absolutely pointless efforts to recall Scott Walker. In short, Dems saw the occupation of the Capitol as a chance to needle their way into the governor's mansion. From the start, it was so clear that the Dems weren't interested at all in saving unions from Walker. Unions and the hundreds of thousands of people rising up for themselves were merely a tool. Indeed, Dems even threw Tom Barrett, a historically anti-union candidate, into the mix, even despite the fact that a pro-union candidate was already running as a Democrat. People who had protested in the streets and slept in the Capitol groused about his uninspired record on workers' rights and public education. He never inspired or unified the movement that had made a recall possible, and it showed on Election Day. Walker beat Barrett by 7 percentage points, almost his exact margin of victory in 2010. Democrats and their union allies needed to win over new voters and old enemies. By all accounts, they failed. But failing to unseat Walker was less important ultimately than succeeding in unseating the power of the people. Tom Barrett was the safe choice. He was somebody who had run for governor before, knew the game, but could be polished in a fix like this one, and served up as a slightly less shitty version of the same establishment turd. Democrats would again try this strategy in the 2016 presidential election, and I think we all know how that played out. But there again, a progressive is far more scary to Democrats than a union buster or indeed a fascist. As the saying in Wisconsin goes, the Cheddar Revolution was buried in a mountain of ballots. And it is a saying that could easily translate to many other instances, likewise this synopsis by Andy Kroll. The energy of the Wisconsin uprising was never electoral. The movement's mistake, letting itself be channeled solely into traditional politics. The takeaway from Walker's decisive win on Tuesday is not that Wisconsin's new populist movement is dead. It's that such a movement does not fit comfortably into the present political/electoral system, stuffed as it is with corporate money, overflowing with bizarre ads and media horse racemanship. Its members' beliefs are too diverse to be confined in what American electoral politics has become. It simply couldn't be squeezed into a system that stifles and in some cases silences the kind of voices and energies it possessed. And we saw this same kind of silencing, stifling, and outright brutality in the Occupy movement, which blossomed later that same year. Initially, the Dems praised the movement, assuming it would serve their interests much like the Tea Party became an arm of the most conservative wing of the GOP. However, when it became clear that a diverse anti-corporate, anti-capitalist agenda was more important to the Occupy movement than electoral politics, the crackdown was swift and brutal, with Democrat-led cities from New York to Oakland among the most brutal of all. Not to mention the fact that Dem-led agencies actually sat down with the fucking banks in order to figure out the best ways to kill the Occupy movement. In a 2012 Guardian article, Naomi Wolf outlines new information at the time that showed the cops and DHS working for and with banks to target, arrest, and politically disable peaceful American citizens. Add to that list the FBI and Obama, the poster child for Wall Street and recent winner of a $400,000 payday from Wall Street. Together, this motley crew of oligarchists and capitalists were only too happy to precipitate the Occupy crackdown. The Bush-appointed head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, eventually retired in 2013, but not before Obama praised him as one of the most admired public servants of our time. And despite the waves of sympathy Comey is getting recently, that little shit was no saint. An outspoken proponent of plenty of awfulness, from enhanced interrogation, aka torture, to prosecuting Snowden. As you can imagine, or as you know, there's no shortage of muck to rake up on the Democrats. Their stand on any progressive pedestal is just another hallucination in this mirage democracy. And there's no amount of barbecue that can change that. And nor is there any reason to think that change is something that the Dems are suddenly interested in. Already, we're seeing center-left pundits and party officials insist that in order to win in 2020, the party will have to shift further to the right, abandoning real progressive causes like universal health care, a universal basic income, or even transgender rights, in the name of hopelessly appealing to white upper-middle-class racists who are going to vote Republican anyway. The Dems will be the Dems will be the Dems will be the establishment. And if our movements are fighting the ills of said establishment, we are also fighting the Democrats. As Kroll wrote, actions like Wisconsin do not fit into today's electoral system. By definition, any movement concerned with progress and change cannot fit in or be defined by existing parties or party lines. Today, we're seeing diverse causes come together, from prison abolition to climate change, into intersectional movements opposed to systemic inequality and the growing power of the rich. And once again, we're faced with a choice. Participate in the same old cycle of shifting from neoliberal Democrats to conservative Republicans, back again at the ballot box, and always drifting a little further to the right, or doing something different to break free by insisting all of our voices are heard. If there's any time that we can break this cycle, it would be now, in this state of emergency provoked by the megalomaniac in the White House, and we do it by building connections between all the people and communities under threat. The occupation of Wisconsin's state capital and many of the occupying encampments created those connections, made it easy to just walk on over and get involved, to build based on common ground, not a red or blue divide. But we can't stop there. As admirable as it is to confront politicians at their town hall meetings, it is still an appeal to the existing power structure and to legislators that have already shown a blatant disregard for human rights and the earth. We need better alternatives to the candidates that we have now, and we ourselves need to build the alternative communities that we want to see, not wait for them to just blossom from the powers that be. Through education, network building, and most of all, street-level direct action, we can begin to build alternatives to the two-party illusion. Alternatives that begin with real people-powered solutions, not top-down, profit-driven corporate politics as usual. Moving on to the front lines, if you follow us on Facebook, you'll know that there have been a couple of updates in the Standing Rock story. If you recall from episode 104 and our interview with Tangerine Bolin, a dozen plaintiffs from 4 tribes are suing Trump over the Dakota Access Pipeline, claiming that their religious rights have been violated due to the incredible environmental threat posed by the pipeline. The plaintiffs claim that Trump pushed the Army Corps of Engineers to grant the easement without proper religious or environmental review. Well, last week, in a separate case on the same issue, a federal judge ruled that the federal permits authorizing the pipeline to cross the Missouri River just upstream of the Standing Rock Reservation, which were hastily issued by the Trump administration just days after the inauguration, violated the law in certain critical respects. And while this does not equal a shutdown of pipeline operations, it is a critical step in recognizing Native rights and environmental impact. Next steps include a hearing today, June 21st, in D.C. that will determine how to proceed in this case, i.e. whether the judge will demand the pipeline be switched off, pending the Army Corps' compliance with the judge's opinion. This is good news, but the battle is far from over. And as Earth Justice, the legal team in this case, outlined on their site, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, does not require the government to make the most environmentally protective decision. It prohibits uninformed decision-making, but doesn't prohibit actions that carry risk, of course. This is obvious to anyone that looks at EIS or environmental impact statements for any of the thousands of dirty and destructive energy projects in this country. You can't count on the powers that be to make a solid choice, even when they have information. Indeed, as an echo of the earlier story, the only ones who can make informed, solid decisions on behalf of the people are the people themselves. So to keep up to date on new developments in this case and to get involved with ongoing cases, check out Earth Justice at earthjustice.org. Wrapping up today, what do you see when you think of Native American art? Chances are that the visual is probably cliché and also stuck in the past, and it's about time that that changed. Anna Tsouhlarakis is a multimedia artist who challenges not only the paradigm of Native American art, but also the flat and vapid world of modern art that often seeks to depoliticize and de-soul art and artists. Take a look. So you're an Indigenous artist, and in your artist statement, you write about the restrictions on the public view of Native art, which I found really interesting, that it's very single-faceted and purely traditional, it seems. Talk about the importance of that and your counter to that, and how this traditional perspective on art sort of cripples the public perception of Native people as a whole.
I think when kind of non-natives think about natives or Indigenous people, they tend to come at it with their own personal expectations of what they are seeing and kind of how they feel about things. And so specifically with art, I think non-natives tend to think that everything has to be very kind of traditionally based, like handmade, craft-based, and usually very beautiful in a very, and it's all about aesthetics and in the very kind of like, in a very single kind of conventional way. Mm-hmm. And so when we veer out of that, people can't understand how that could possibly be Native art. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's what I'm really interested in doing, is stretching those boundaries of what is kind of perceived as Native art. So,
and how do you feel that that perception of the sort of like staunchly, non-natives perceiving Native art as having to be traditional, how does that negatively affect like the perception of Indigenous people?
I mean, I think it just tries to keep us in a box. Right. I mean, the whole idea of kind of keeping natives on reservations is that idea of containment, of control, of power. And, that goes over into the way that, we deal with people in our economies, within our political system, within, the way that, not just about art, but also the way that we look. There's one definitive way. I mean, we can talk about the national football team here in DC, right, and how that plays a gigantic role in perceptions of what natives should look like. And so, I don't know, I think trying to create new avenues, new ways of thinking about that is really, really important, specifically in this landscape. I feel like a lot of ideas, like I said, people come to either, Native American art or Native American film or anything kind of dealing with natives with a very stereotypical view and, their own kind of limited, expectation. And so I think that by working in different ways, I'm able to kind of surprise them, mm-hmm, and to also kind of disrupt their idea that everything should be stoic, mm-hmm, and serious. And at times, usually specifically with Native Americans, that we have to be the educator, mm-hmm, that somehow we're, this whole idea of the shaman, or, the people of the wise, not that we're not wise or anything like that, but the idea that that's the only thing that we have to be. And I like kind of bringing in the seriousness, but also being kind of goofy about it. And I think that's why a lot of times within the aesthetic that I work isn't necessarily about perfection. Like it's meant to be handmade and like the duct tape is holding it together way. And I want to show those, the fray on the edges, because I think it's important to show that we're multidimensional, that we can make fun of ourselves, that we don't take ourselves too seriously, and that whatever I'm putting forth, you know, might be serious and it might be real, but also might be just making an ass out of you, you know. And so that's what I love doing. Is turning the tables in different ways and kind of upsetting any thinking that you will kind of have when you kind of look at my work. So
I like that. That's awesome. So talk about, because obviously you do pieces not only in different mediums but in different places. So talk about the difference between gallery pieces and performance pieces for you.
I think like when I think about my performance work, I don't consider myself like a performer in many ways. Like I usually tend to do performance pieces on my own or with one person who's filming it or photographing it for stills. And it's a very private thing. It's not meant to be something that I would do on a stage. And so those, you know, tend to be really thoughtful about exactly kind of what's happening, about the framing of it. And I think within the gallery, I try to kind of be, you know, as open, because for me as an artist, I'm not worried about selling work. I'm not, of course, like it'd be awesome to sell work, but I don't want that to drive me, because I feel like the usual market of Native work is all about selling. You go to these big markets out west, like in Santa Fe, and people are making jewelry or making pottery. And not that there's anything wrong with that, because a lot of people make their livelihood from that, but it's dictated by the buyers. It's dictated by the curators. And growing up, that's what I saw. My dad's a Native artist, and he makes traditional work, jewelry specifically. And he takes great pride in it, and I respect like the mastery that he has of making jewelry. I want to dictate what I make, right. And I think specifically within museums and galleries, I want to make sure that my voice is the one that's driving the work, and it's not kind of being forced by this or that, which is why I've never really been interested in gallery representation. And also why I think I work in so many different mediums, because I don't want to be pigeonholed. I know that in a lot of ways that's what artists strive for, is to have a style, a recognizable style. But because that's something that is so pervasive within Native art, specifically the way that somebody comes up with a design, and while that is our traditional philosophy in a lot of ways, because that holds on to different things, I wanted to kind of go beyond that as well. And so never be defined by my medium.
And that also goes back to the idea of a complex identity, that it's not just pigeonholed by this one single faceted aspect. Finally, talk about the piece that was on display. Hopefully we can find some pictures to throw in the interview. But talk about the piece that was on display, because I was really struck by it, not just because of the aesthetic of the movement of the words and sort of this sort of spiral sense, but also how you use the space. I mean, it was great how it was in a corner, but then it kind of like went off into the next hallway, and it went up the wall and on the glass, and it basically felt like you were like saying, fuck this space, I'm going to use it in a way that you didn't expect me to, and here it is. And talk about that piece.
I mean, I think that's exactly what it was for me, was that it was in this very beautiful, you know, mansion. And, you know, they were creating walls for the space that were nice and clean. And, you know, a lot of the other artists were hanging work and everything, and it looked beautiful. But I really wanted to create a piece that was disrupting that beauty in some way and wasn't relying on the beauty in order to frame my work. And I wanted to create an awkward piece. And I knew, you know, when this opportunity came up, that I wanted to do something about the pipeline. In last October, I went with my kids, and we went up to Standing Rock, and we were there for about 3 or 4 days. My family came up from the Southwest, and it was an amazing experience. And so I've kept, you know, a very close eye on kind of what has been happening up there, and the different events and marches and rallies and stuff that we've had locally. And so I knew that I wanted to create something there, because I don't show in DC very often. And specifically this was in Georgetown, in kind of a high profile space. I knew I wanted to do something with that. And I knew that I wanted to kind of highlight the words of local community, or community that were kind of in support of the Standing Rock tribe. And so that's where the idea kind of came from. And I knew that I wanted those words to be uncomfortable, or kind of to create some uncomfortableness in that space. And so I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to do that. And then when I was thinking about actually putting text, using the text, at first I was thinking about, creating it kind of orderly. And then I realized, this whole mess of a situation, this issue isn't orderly. Like it's seeping just like the oil would through the land. I mean, it's just an uncomfortable kind of eyesore in some ways. And so I wanted to create that. Of course, I kind of went about it in a more interesting way than just like making everything, throwing black paint everywhere. But I wanted to create a scene that wasn't using the space like you would expect it to be used. So that's kind of where that was. And I, again, like with the word, there's some things that are very serious, and there were some lines that were, kind of goofy and like, what the hell was that person talking about?
So were these lines from people that you had interacted with at Standing Rock?
I actually, so I usually try to, anytime I use text like this in installations, I tend to only use text from Native people because that's kind of what I feel comfortable with. But for this specific piece, because so many different people, different types of people were involved, I actually would just go on to Facebook pages and articles that were around this. And I like this idea too, because a lot of what was happening and all the support really came from, getting connected through social media. Right. And that's where the kind of groundswell of voices came from, after they started the encampment last year. And so I used just like look through comments basically, and culled different comments from all of the, different articles and sites, and then just kind of saw what fit within the space.
To learn more about Anna and her work, visit Naviks.com. And that'll do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide to see all the sites mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. Until next time, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.